Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today is once again a video that I have been meaning to film for a while now. However, the reason why I'm finally sitting down to film this video is that I saw a person having a stupid take on Twitter. That take basically being that there's no adult fantasy. It was a weird take, let me read it to you. I actually pulled up the tweet, it's 2 tweets actually. But the first tweet said, I am tired of every fantasy book being about teenagers, which they're not, but okay, I guess. Also, by the way, I'm gonna leave these tweets mostly uncommented because, yeah, I could probably make a whole video on its own just, you know, refuting these tweets. But anyway, the second tweet is, let me clarify some stuff. I know adult fantasy is a whole genre on its own. Why did you make the first tweet then? I know I am reading YA. No, I will not stop reading YA fantasy. Well, then don't complain that the main characters are teenagers. It's literally what YA is about. Fourth, I'm not bashing YA. Fifth, if you have Rex, let me know. My main point is, most popular fantasy is YA. It is very hard to find adult fantasy. It's not like every single bookstore has a whole section just labeled fantasy and it's all adult fantasy. And it's also not like the most popular fantasy series are actually adult fantasy. Like, let's talk Sanderson, George R. Martin, The Lord of the Rings. These are all adult fantasy series. I mean, you can talk about representation within adult high fantasy, which I do think generally tends to be better a lot of the times within YA than in adult fantasy, or at least marginalized authors I feel like have a better chance of becoming more popular compared to adult high fantasy, because adult high fantasy obviously is still very white and male. But generally speaking, I would not say that the most popular fantasy series are all YA. I would actually say that the majority of them are adult series. But anyway, that's not what this video is going to be about, because I do think somewhere hidden between these lines is a somewhat legitimate problem that I have seen people have with adult high fantasy. And that is that it might seem like YA adult, the only difference is really what age the characters might be, or at what age you as the reader read them. But I do think there's quite a few more differences between YA fantasy and adult fantasy. Also, my batteries just started blinking, so let me change that and then I'm gonna be back. So I am back and I forgot where I was, although I think I was talking about the difference between YA and adult, and that there's more of a difference between the two age categories than just, you know, the age of the readers or the age of the main characters or whatever. First of all, because obviously within adult you get characters of any age group. You get children main characters, you get teenagers main characters, you get adults, you get older people, although within adult fantasy that's still quite rare. And within YA, yeah, you do mostly have teenagers. Also, I would actually almost say that YA fiction in general is not just an age category, but also a genre on its own, because you do have very common tropes and very common themes that, you know, you can see throughout all different genres. So I would say YA almost is a genre on its own, although you obviously can't really have just a YA book the way you can have a just fantasy book. But you have fantasy horror sometimes, you have a horror thriller, you can have a contemporary fantasy, whatever. So I think YA you could almost categorize as a genre, whereas adult fiction I don't think you can really categorize as a genre, and it's really just an age category. But even saying that, it can be kind of hard to say where's the line between YA fantasy and adult fantasy. However, there is a big difference there. And that's where I'll go back to the take on Twitter, and where I think there might be a legitimate problem hidden in there somewhere. And that is that I do see readers of YA fantasy struggling to get into adult fantasy, because there is a big difference between the two. You, yes, sometimes have characters of very similar age, but you have different themes, you have different writing, you have a very different pacing. YA stories will a lot of the times be a lot faster paced than adult high fantasy. That is not to say that you can't have fast paced adult fantasy, but there's still something different about the way adult fantasy is fast-paced. It's kind of hard to explain, especially as someone who doesn't really do literary analysis. So, you know, I don't really have the vocabulary to explain it. But I think if you read a lot of fantasy, you know what I'm talking about. Then also, I think I already mentioned themes and tropes that are different between YA and adult fantasy, where a lot of times, of course, YA fantasy will focus a lot more around themes of growing up, around finding your identity and so on, which can be present within adult fantasy, but a lot of times it's like the way they're dealt with is done in a more mature and grown-up way. I don't know how else to explain it, because obviously it's just written for a different audience. Also, obviously, the contents of the books are different. In adult fantasy, you will find more adult content, you will find more brutality, you will find more sexual contents, more swearing and so on than you will in YA fantasy. And then something else that I also find is that YA fantasy 99% of the time tends to be very, very character focused. And obviously adult fantasy can also be character focused, but the way it's done is often done in a more of a character exploration type of way. And also, even if you have character-based adult fantasy, the plot and the world building will be a much bigger role within the fantasy story, because a lot of times adult fantasy just is a lot more complex and less straightforward, which does not necessarily always have to do with the fact that it's for an older and more mature audience, but also just has to do with the basic fact that adult fantasy has more words at its disposal than YA fantasy does. More words means more space for exploring things. And so with all of that in mind, if you're a YA fantasy reader jumping into adult fantasy for the first time, you might find books that you think you should be able to read quite easily because you're used to reading fantasy, but that you might find quite strange, and where the reading experience is very different from what you're expecting because you're a YA reader. And so because of that, I do think there's like legitimate reasons why YA fantasy readers sometimes have difficulties getting into adult fantasy, even though they're like growing out of YA or whatever, and reading about teenage characters with very much a focus of the story being on those problems of those teenage characters rather than, you know, the surrounding world. All of that doesn't mean, however, that there aren't books that are adult fantasy that, however, in my opinion, have very much a crossover appeal to YA, be it because of how the characters are written, how character focused the story is, how fast-paced it is, how the writing style works, and so on. And all of that was the very long intro to me now sitting down to tell you that this is a recommendation video for those types of books. So yeah, I am a long-winded person. I think you already know that. I have, I think, 7 books right here that, in my opinion, have quite a bit of YA adult crossover appeal, and that I think are good to pick up if you want to get into adult fantasy and kind of dip your toes into it a little bit. And so on this list, I have 3 high fantasy, I have 2 kind of portal type fantasy, and I have 2 historical fantasy, and let's start with those. First, I have the Winter Night Trilogy by Catherine Arden. This is one of those types of series where the writing, I would say, it's kind of hard to say if it's adult or YA. I think this series very much has the atmosphere that a good fairy tale has, where it's kind of almost ageless. And also, I think if you've been on BookTube for a while, I don't really have to explain what this series is about. However, I still will do so. This series starts with the bear and the nightingale and is set set in Russia long ago. We follow our main character Vasya, who is quite young at the beginning of the book. I believe she's like 12 or 13 years old, if I remember correctly. And she lives in a little village where the people there still mostly honor the old gods and the spirits and so on. Now one day a priest of a new religion arrives in their village, and slowly the villagers start abandoning the old gods in favor of the new one, which brings certain problems with it, and Vasya might be the only one who will be able to save them all. The spirits, the old spirits and villagers alike. I really enjoyed this series. The series is beautifully written. I don't remember it being like the most fast-paced written story. However, since all the books are on the shorter side for fantasy books, they're all under 500 pages, I still think that together with the themes of growing up around Vasya, and also the way that this is somewhat similar to a retelling, or at least a book inspired by a lot of folklore, I do think that this also works for readers who are mostly used to YA fantasy. The second historical fiction I have is also very folklore inspired, and that is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This one is a story inspired by Mayan folklore, and it's set at the beginning of the 20th century in Mexico, and we follow, what's her name, Cassiopeia, who basically is treated as a servant by her family. However, one day she opens a box and accidentally frees the Mayan god of death. Because of that, she is now bound to him, and she has to help him reclaim his throne and has to meet certain challenges to do so. The reason why I think this very much meets the YA crossover appeal is because a lot of this book follows Cassiopeia as she discovers who she is, since she hasn't really been able to do so far because of how she was treated by her family. And so she goes on this journey, and this journey very much is a journey of finding her identity, as well as a physical journey, as well as a magical, mystical journey, obviously. And so yeah, I can just really highly recommend this if you want to dip your toes into adult fantasy. So next I have the two, I would say, portal fantasies, although they're not really portal fantasies, but you know, they are fantasies that are very much inspired once again by folklore, and where our world exists and is confirmed to exist. However, the majority of these books is not set within our world. And the first book I want to talk about is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. This is the first book in the, I don't know anymore what it's called, duology. The second book comes out at the end of the year, and this is a story that is inspired by the Chinese legend of Zhang Yi, the moon goddess. In this one, we follow Xing Yin, who is the daughter of the moon goddess. However, she has been growing up in secret. Her mother never told the other celestials that she exists. The reason for that being that her mother has been imprisoned on the moon without the celestials knowing that she was pregnant. Now, one day our main character finds all of that out, and so she decides to go on a journey to save her mother from imprisonment. And that's the basic gist of this first book. The reason why I think this has a lot of crossover appeal is because the basic story structure of this story very much follows, you know, typical YA stories. You have our main character who has grown up very sheltered, who has to leave her home, has to go discover what she can do. She has to go on a quest also, which also obviously this connection between finding yourself and going on a quest is something that is very common within YA. You have certain elements like the love interests, a bit of a love triangle and so on, that are also quite common within YA. And so that's personally for me the reason why I think this has great crossover appeal. Also, I believe all the books that I'm talking about today I have reviews up for on my channel, so I will leave all of those reviews in the description linked down below if you're interested in learning a bit more about a single one of these books. But yeah, can highly recommend this. The second portal fantasy I have is the Daevabad Trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, starting with City of Brass. The reason why I think this one very much has crossover appeal is because this is one of those books, actually Daughter of the Moon Goddess as well, where I think the main reason why this would be shelved or is shelved as adult is because the characters are on the older side. So the characters are in their early 20s rather than teenagers. So these two books really are the perfect fit, I would say, if you read a lot of YA fantasy. This series also is very fast-paced, even though the last two books are on the longer side already, so, you know, longer than your usual YA fantasy. In this series we follow Nadi, who is a con woman living in Cairo. One day she accidentally summons a jinn, and that jinn, you know, spirits her away to this magical city of Daevabad where all the other jinn live, and through that she kind of gets caught up in the politics of the city of Daevabad, and there's mysteries and there's love triangles and everything and so on. This one is another one where there's just a lot of elements from a lot of typical YA fiction. You once again have the search for identity and the identity crisis, which actually identity once again also is a very common theme within fantasy and just a lot of different fiction, but the way it's handled here, I would say actually pretty much is like, you know, the crossover as well. I would say the way it's handled here is not like you're already a proper adult but now you have an identity crisis, but it's also not you're a teenager and haven't even found your identity yet. It very much fits the early 20s. You feel like you're supposed to already know who you are, but you really don't type of identity crisis. So yeah, I think this series actually is perfect for those types of people who say, you know, I really like the way YA is written, but also I can't really connect to the characters anymore because they're kind of too young. I do think this series is perfect for you. And lastly, the three high fantasies, which actually two of those are standalones. So if series aren't your thing, I have something for you there. First, let's talk about Star Eater by Kirsten Hall. In this one, we follow our main character, Elfreda, who is part of a sisterhood of priestesses. And these priestesses are kind of cannibalistic, meaning they eat each other's flesh. The reason why they do that is it gives them magic powers, which they need to defeat the zombies that are appearing throughout their country and throughout their world. And so Elfreda is a novice within the sisterhood. However, one day she finds out some things that maybe she's not supposed to know, and things start happening from there. The reason why I think this has very good YA crossover appeal is because the way this is written is not like on the level of complexity that a lot of other adult high fantasy series have, because obviously it's a standalone. That's also something that I always recommend. If you want to get into adult high fantasy, start with standalones, because a lot of adult high fantasies, a lot of longer series have a lot of plot threads that you need to, you know, remember what's going on. But obviously if you're not used to that, that can be kind of overwhelming at the beginning. And so standalones are always a good place to start. Also, Elfreda is one of those main characters who's, you know, in her early 20s. She hasn't really found herself yet. She so far has just, you know, blindly followed the sisterhood, and now she kind of wants to start thinking on her own and for her own. And so yeah, that's why I think this has great crossover appeal. However, if you have a weak stomach, if you don't like blood and gore and so on, this series might not be for you, because it can be quite gruesome at times. And while it's not horror in the sense that, you know, it's scary or anything, I would say that there's some very horrific elements within this book. Next, I have The Vanishing Queen by Lisbeth Campbell. This is a dual POV, third person though, standalone fantasy. One of the POVs we follow is Anza, who is part of a rebellion trying to get rid of the tyrant of this country. The other POV that we follow is the second son of said tyrant, who has some motivations of his own to want to get rid of his father. And so yeah, I read this 2 years ago, I believe. I really enjoyed it. Once again, this is one of those books that is quite fast-paced for an adult fantasy. It's also a standalone. Both characters are in their early 20s, so once again you get a lot of the themes of, you know, finding yourself, growing up, whatever. You also have quite a prominent romance subplot, if I remember correctly, so that's also something that is more common within YA rather than adult fantasy, unless you go into fantasy romance. A lot of times adult high fantasy won't necessarily have the most prominent romance subplots. And so yeah, I can really recommend this if you want to get into fantasy. I'm actually trying to kind of already wrap this up because I have once again been filming for quite a long time already. So the last book I want to talk about is a book that I only recently read, and that is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. This is an Arabian inspired and Arabian Nights 1001 Nights inspired adult high fantasy as well. It's the first book in a, I believe it's going to be a trilogy, and in this one we follow multiple different characters, but our central character pretty much is, what was her name? I am so bad with names, I can't tell you. Our main character is Luli, who is the Midnight Merchant. What that means is she collects relics left over from jinn and she sells them illegally. Because of that, that gives the Sultan of the city or of the country that she lives in the opportunity to blackmail her into getting him one of the most powerful relics ever. And so she, as well as the prince, so the son of the Sultan, as well as one of the 40 thieves of the prince, as well as her very own bodyguard, go on a journey, go on a quest to get this relic. This one for me was another one of those books that just for me is very perfect to get into adult fantasy if you have started with YA. This book for me is just another one, obviously, as all the books I've been talking about in this video, that's just perfect if you want to get into adult fantasy from YA fantasy, because I feel like it's already more complex and more intricate due to the, you know, word count compared to a lot of YA fantasy. However, it's not quite there with a lot of other adult fantasy. It's not as dry as adult fantasy can be. It's not as slow as a lot of adult fantasy can be. It's still very character focused rather than plot or themes focused, which, you know, adult fantasy can be quite often. It's also not character focused in a way where it's a character exploration, but in a, I don't know, character focused way, in a plot focused way. I don't know how to explain it. And also, while it's longer and while it looks a bit thicker, maybe it's still on this side of 500, so it's under 500 pages, so that's also always quite good. And I think with this book I'm gonna leave you. Tell me in the comments down below if you're a YA fantasy reader. Are you gonna pick up any of the books that I just recommended? If you're someone who is quite well versed within adult fantasy already, maybe leave some more recommendations in the comments down below. If someone is coming from YA fantasy, what would you recommend to them? If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All links to my social media as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will be left in the description box down below. And again, all the books that I do have reviews for will also be left in the description box down below, or all the reviews that I have for books that I just mentioned. And with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!